I think the history matters the most, and what you've mentioned is so important in the context of what's going on today with the United States. When you see, for example, the ambassador, the U.S. ambassador to Israel says that all we have is dependent on Israel because of Israel. And when did that shift happen, Larry, in the history of the United States, that they see themselves as totally dependent on Israel and the future of Israel?
Well,
Because, yeah, go ahead.
well, no, I say it didn't happen in just one moment. Uh, it's I look I've I've been born and grown up during this entire period. Um, in the 1950s, and actually this was just before I was born, when Israel with France and Britain tried to take control of the Suez Canal, and President Eisenhower said, "Hell no, no, get back in your own box." He prevented that. Um, it was I don't want to say there was a group of prominent Zionists that got together and said, "Hey, let's do this," but you know, I think there was an aspect of that because when when the movie Exodus came out with Paul Newman, and I think it was Eva Marie Saint who played opposite of him, that that was told this story of it was basically the David and Goliath story retold in modern terms, with Zionists as David against this Goliath of the Arab nations who was trying to crush them just because they wanted to be free. So that became part of American culture. It didn't really necessarily translate into political support at that time, because at the same time as that movie's out, you have John F. Kennedy beginning to try to stop Israel from getting the nuclear weapon. And I think there's compelling evidence to show that Israel was involved with the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And yet that gets swept under the way. Lyndon Baines Johnson was an early Zionist. He was romantically linked to a woman who had ties with Mossad. So he was being manipulated, and actually, made some money off of it too. He was an incredibly corrupt president. So then we get into the war, the 6-Day War in '67. Again, Israel prevails in that. It reinforces the David versus Goliath image. Then you get to the Yom Kippur War, 1973. And so in that, again, Israel was prevailing over Jordan, Egypt, Syria. And then it was in that period that the USS Liberty is attacked, and that gets completely. The USS Liberty happened while Lyndon Johnson was president back in I think '67, and that gets completely swept under the rug, completely covered up. So there's an effort to, there's a propaganda effort to portray Israel as good and righteous and actually within it within the evangelical movement, there was seen this is a fulfillment of prophecy. The establishment of the nation of Israel was fulfilling the prophecy of events that have to take place before Jesus returns, and so that becomes then part of the official narrative. All of this gets, I think it really starts getting solidified after the attacks on 9/11, because Israel, I believe Israel played a direct role in allowing that to happen. They knew they knew that the plot was afoot, as did some within the CIA. You can say that allowed deliberately to happen, or it was a case where the right hand didn't know what the left hand was doing. I'll let people argue that out on their own. But what is clear is that from the Zionist standpoint, that attack was going to provide a predicate for the United States now to invade Afghanistan, invade Iraq, ultimately take out Syria. This plan to eliminate all these Arab Muslim nations on the periphery. And so, I think that's when AIPAC really became a powerful force in U.S. politics. So over the last 25 years, and they become more blatant with each passing year. And this is, I think, 2026 will be marked as the year where they finally crossed the line, and the combination of the genocide being inflicted upon the Palestinian people, upon both Palestinians who are Muslim, Palestinians who are Christian, and then the direct and gross interference in U.S. domestic politics. So there wasn't one moment, but I think it's become particularly pervasive over the last 25 years.
Looking at the roots of this support to Israel, which is Israel is a British project, was a British project. And I don't know how it was handed over to the United States. And how do you see the roots of those supports? Are they coming from the British Empire? Are they coming from the British establishment? Or is it all made in the United States?
Well, remember, Israel, this entire piece of land, Palestine, Judea, Samaria, whatever names you want to attach to it, it was a colonial creation flowing out of World War I with the defeat of the Ottoman Empire and its law, because it used to rule over that area, and so its loss of control. And then, you create these artificial, I call them artificial countries. I mean, Lebanon was there, but it didn't have this national identity. It was a agglomeration of Sunnis and Shias and Druze and Christians. Similar thing for Syria. Similar thing with Iraq, Jordan. So the boundaries of these countries, there was not some strong national identity attached to them. In many cases, they cut across. There were tribes. The tribal identity carried more weight, and they were on both sides of some of the borders. So I guess the failure to have at the end of World War II, the British power had started to erode. That World War II really marked the beginning of the end for the British Empire, because before then it was still struggling to maintain control of India and South Africa, and so it began losing its grip on power. And remember, during the terrorist groups in Israel, the Irgun and the Stern Gang, each of those headed up by a man who later became, in each case, became a president. Menachem Begin became president or the prime minister of Israel, as did Yitzhak Shamir. But they were terrorists in the classical sense, attacking civilians for killing, inflicting violence for political purposes. And their attack on the King David Hotel, put them at odds with the Brits. So the Brits sort of walked away from it. And it was, the United States that played the critical role in the vote in the United Nations, in part because of Harry Truman. And Truman, it was, if you go to the Truman Library in Independence, they got a whole presentation, one little room where they recount the story and of Truman's relationship with his former business partner, who was Jewish, who intervened and begged him to, to support the creation of the state of Israel. So it was a Zionist project that came to fruition in the aftermath of World War II with the help of Harry Truman.
Yeah. I think what has happened in Europe in terms of the nationalism, because nationalism was part of what was happening in those days in Europe, and the reason that they tried to force the Jewish people outside of Europe was part of that. You have the British government, the Zionism being created by Christians mostly in the United Kingdom, and we have then the Jewish people being that ideology has somehow resonated with the Jewish community, at least some people within the Jewish community, and then sending them to the West Asia, and they're going to have their land, and they're going to have their nationalism, they're going to create their country there. And my understanding is that it was all about the European agenda in the West Asia, because you have an Israeli, you get rid of Jews in Europe, sending them to the West Asia, because to be honest, they hated Jews in Europe. You understand the whole concept of sending Jewish people to the West Asia. It was all based on the hatred.
Right.
And then you see the agenda coming along. You have a new state in the West Asia together, dividing as the colony. The British Empire divided the whole region in little states. You see Saudi Arabia, UAE, Oman, the desert of Oman. Right now we have two states, UAE and Oman, which all was the desert of Oman. It was called the desert of Oman. Right now we have two states. It was all created by the British Empire. And the leadership of Qatar, the leadership of Saudi Arabia and UAE, all coming from Saudi Arabia, what we know right now as Saudi Arabia. And these people are coming from the same sort of families or ilk. And it was all, and then you have the British government controlling the Iranian oil. For many years, they were controlling the Iran, and so they had the total dominance over the West Asia.
That's been the key to all of this. It's about oil and control over energy. I mean, before it was realized that they had this vast store of oil and that was rich in that resource, nobody cared about. It was some just exotic land that nobody paid attention to.
Yeah, I think that the problem has started when we had, the nationalization of Iranian oil in 1950. During the Mossadegh, and then the removal of Mossadegh and the Shah of Iran coming into power or somehow dominating the whole political system of Iran. But what was so important is that you're going to divide the whole West Asia, little states, and you're going to dominate, you're going to rule, we're going to, control everything. Today, compared to what has happened in those days and what we're witnessing right now, Israel is trying to do somehow to expand its territory, but you see a new sort of understanding coming to the mind of the leaders in the region. But the United States is keeping, for the same sort of agenda as the British Empire had before. I don't know what is the sentiment in Washington? Is that the same agenda as the British Empire? Or is it's something new? They literally want to put Israel in charge of the West Asia. What is that, in your opinion?
No, I don't think there's a goal to put Israel in charge. I think it is to make sure that Israel doesn't face any kind of military threat or opposition. So it can be the leading military power in the region, but ultimately it's all about, again, maintaining control over the energy sources if possible for the West, and that's that's one of the real challenges that Trump faces right now. I've talked about this before with you, that with the shutdown of the Strait of Hormuz on the 28th of February, that didn't mean an end to the oil that was headed to the United States from the Persian Gulf. There were oil tankers on the high seas at that point that had left the Strait of Hormuz on the 28th of February, and it took them that last tanker took about 42 days to get to the United States, which takes you to April 8th, April 10th. Well, are you surprised that that's the date when the United States was keen on seeking a ceasefire with Iran? I don't believe in coincidence. So they realized at that date that they needed to get the Strait of Hormuz open and get the oil flowing again, and that remains sort of the critical objective, because the way the U.S. refinery system is set up, how these refineries are built, what they are structured to do, is to refine this high sulfur oil, and then within that oil, what they're called the mid distillates, about 30%, 25 to 30% of that barrel of oil goes to the production of diesel fuel and aviation fuel. Those are the two critical fuels that run the U.S. economy, not gas that, you put in your regular automobile, diesel and aviation fuel. And the United States does not, it's the way its refinery system is set up, even though the United States is independent with, light crude or sweet crude, those refineries aren't set up to produce the aviation fuel and diesel from that light crude. They need to have the heavy sulfur stuff, and on that, the United States is a net importer. So, how do we get that stuff out of the Strait of Hormuz? And that's where the United States is focused right now on trying. They wanted to get the strait open, and yet, going back to April 15th, it didn't get the strait reopened, and so it's only since in the last week or so that oil, in the last 18, 19 days, that you started to get oil coming out of the Persian Gulf, except that's not going to the United States. It's going to Asia. This is, I guess, what we're seeing now is a time in which the control the United States once exercised over the area and thought it had under its control has disappeared. There are indications that the Saudis and the Qataris are moving away from their traditional military diplomatic relations with the United States. Qatar, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, they continue to be sort of lackeys of the U.S., but not Qatar and the Saudis. That's different.
Yeah. Do you think, Larry, that you mentioned that they want Israel to dominate the region militarily? It means that nobody's going to be able to fight Israel or to have some sort of upper hand.
Right.
But we have the region that is totally different from the picture that the United States wants or Israel wants, which is that you have Iran, you have Turkey. These are two important countries in the region. You have Pakistan redefining its role in the region, which is so important, in my opinion, particularly in the aftermath or, in the process of negotiations between Iran and the United States. You see the important role of Pakistan. And Israel somehow seen all these three countries as a threat to the future of Israel. And here comes the role of the United States. Are they going to go against these countries? Are they going to do something about, are they going to support the Israeli agenda in the region, or they're going to have their own agenda, their own strategy in the region? This is, I think, this is the identity crisis that I've mentioned before in the West Asia.
Well, it is. It is entirely precipitated by the rise of, I'll call it, the radical Zionists, the settlers, the Ben Gavirs, the Smotriches, where they are intolerant, of Palestinians. And it was fascinating. I saw someone played a clip for me yesterday of Randy Fine, this corpulent member of Congress, who happens to be an ardent Zionist. And he was insisting that, there's never been a Palestinian. The Palestinians it's an artificial creation by the Soviets as part of the war against the West. Well, it turns out that the first reference to Palestine was made by a Greek writer, Herodotus. So we're talking, hundreds of years before Christ was born. So, so much for Randy Fine's claim there is nothing about Palestinians. The first time the Arabs, the inhabitants of that area who were not Jewish, were described as Palestinians was in a translation from a Russian document in 1898 that identified those people as Palestinians. So even Fine's claimed that this was the work of the Soviets. Sorry, Soviet Union didn't exist then. This was still under the rule of the Tsar. But the point is that the presence of these Palestinians, they've always been there. They didn't form a national government. They did, because and unfortunately that Palestine has been a bit of like a football kicked back and forth. The Romans controlled it, and then there were other, let's call them minor rulers that came in from the outside. The Muslims took over, and then finally the Ottoman Empire took control and controlled it for 600 years at least. But just because those people always lived under some sort of foreign domination didn't mean that they had no rights to that land. And now shows up these radical Zionists who insist that they have no rights, that they're Amalek, that they must be destroyed, that Israel is the one from the river to the sea, to the Euphrates. So Israel's ambitions are, they've got, kind of territorial ambitions that we haven't seen since Adolf Hitler, and his quest to grab land in the east from the Russians. So this is something new, and now we see it in continuing belligerent comments and threats issued by a variety of Israelis, including Naftali Bennett, against the Turks. It's like, are you people out of your damn minds? Here is Turkey's providing you. They are your number one supplier of oil, and yet you're threatening to attack them? Plus, from a military standpoint, Turkey is, I would argue, the preeminent military power in the region next to Iran. But especially in terms of ground force, that's why Turkey is always, the NATO's always kept Turkey around, because Turkey represents the second largest army in NATO.